There are moments in life when a presence enters quietly, almost invisibly, and everything within you shifts. You do not recognize it at first, perhaps you never do, but it leaves a tremor along the spine of your existence, an echo that stretches far beyond the hours or days that pass. It is not a love that blooms softly or fades gently. It is a love that awakens. And it awakens not because of gestures or words or fleeting affection, but because of the sheer force of a soul unafraid to be whole. There is a woman sometimes called difficult, sometimes called too intense, who refuses to shrink, to soften, to fit into the contours of what is expected. She carries a freedom so natural, so unyielding, that it becomes unbearable to the men who have lived their lives confined by control, fear, and the desperate need to dominate. To them, she is a riddle, a storm, a mirror, whose reflection cuts deeper than any blade. Society in its quiet insistence has taught men for centuries that power is measured by compliance, by the subtle ability to bend the world to their will. And women have been offered roles as mirrors that do not challenge, but please, that adapt, wait, and conform. But when a woman refuses this choreography, she disrupts the rhythm of expectation. She is not bad. She is not cruel. She simply exists fully, and in doing so, she reflects a truth that terrifies. For what men see in her is not merely independence, it is the reflection of their own untended depths, the uncharted territories of freedom they have never dared to explore. Carl Jung wrote that what we admire or fear in another is a mirror of what our soul longs to integrate. And here lies the paradox. The more he resists her, the more magnetic she becomes, because she is a living symbol of a self he has yet to claim. There is a subtle violence in this awakening, not of hands or words, but of confrontation with the soul. The man who encounters her discovers the cracks in his own ego, the hollows he has filled with dominance and performance. Every boundary she sets, every silence she maintains, every refusal to accommodate his illusions forces him to look inward. And it is not pleasant. It is raw. It is the first pulse of fear and longing coiling around the same moment. She does not fight to be seen, yet she is impossible to ignore. She does not demand admiration, yet she commands it by the very fact of her wholeness. And in the gaze that meets his, he does not merely see her. He sees himself as he has never truly seen, fragile, incomplete, yet capable of becoming something more if he dares. This is why he returns. Not always physically, not always with words, but in memory, in thought, in the quiet ache of recognition that she exposed a part of him he had long denied. Even if he cannot articulate it, even if pride compels him to disguise the truth, he cannot escape the awakening she triggered. She is no conquest. She is a threshold. And for those men, every attempt at control, every strategy of seduction, every gesture of persuasion collapses against the immovable truth of her presence. She is whole, and she will not bow. She becomes a reflection not of desire alone, but of fear and longing intertwined, a silent summons to face what has always been avoided. And in this encounter lies the beginning of transformation. The man who cannot dominate her cannot remain as he was. He is confronted by a shadow of himself, a shadow he cannot banish, and the awareness of that shadow demands movement, demands introspection, demands growth. The very fact that he cannot control her forces a subtle seismic shift. He feels unsteady, yet alive, terrified, yet drawn. And it is in this tension, in the interplay of fear and fascination, that the first spark of change flickers. He comes back in pieces, in fragments of thought, in the quiet moments when the world has softened around him, and the masks he wears feel suddenly heavy. He remembers her gaze steady, unflinching, a light that did not bend for him or for anyone else. He remembers her silence, which spoke louder than any plea, louder than any charm he could muster. And in these recollections, he begins to see for the first time the truth of what he has carried inside himself, a fragile ego, a hunger for validation, a fear that to be vulnerable is to be undone. She never asked him to change for her, yet every encounter with her made it impossible to remain the man he had always thought himself to be. She merely existed, and in existing fully, she demanded that he face himself. He tries to rationalize it at first, to create stories that diminish the force of her presence. She was too proud, too cold, too unyielding, he tells himself. He convinces himself that he did not love her, that he only admired her fire from afar, that he could find comfort elsewhere. But comfort is an illusion, and admiration without awareness is a pale substitute for the raw confrontation she provided. In her presence, he glimpsed what it might mean to be whole, to be present, to be accountable, not to ego, but to soul. And that glimpse burns like a secret, a memory that refuses to fade, because it touched something that had never been touched before. She was not cruel. She was uncompromising. She did not manipulate. She did not demand. She did not bend herself to his whims. She simply carried her essence with the quiet authority of someone who has looked fear in the eye and refused to shrink. And in her refusal to conform, she became the mirror he could not avoid. Every game he had played, every act of seduction, every measure of control dissolved against her calm, unwavering presence. She forced him to confront the futility of domination and the hollowness of performance. And in that confrontation, he felt unmoored. The illusion of power he had built so carefully for himself began to fracture. There is a peculiar terror in meeting such a woman, the terror of being fully seen without the shields of charm or aggression or pretense. She exposes what he has hidden from himself. She shows him the cracks in his armor and the emptiness behind his bravado. And it is painful, almost unbearably so. He may flee, he may deny, he may grasp for control, yet the seed she planted cannot be uprooted. It waits quietly like a slow dawn for him to awaken, and awakening when it finally comes is never gentle. It is the breaking of old patterns, the collapse of familiar facades, the unbearable intimacy of seeing oneself as one truly is. He begins to realize that her absence is not absence at all. It is presence in another form, the echo of a mirror that cannot be ignored, the reminder that he has been confronted unmasked and invited into a new way of being. Every attempt to fill the void with distraction, with charm, with fleeting affection falls short because it was never about her. It was always about the awakening she triggered. And awakening is not comfortable. It is not predictable. It is the slow unraveling of old illusions and the delicate, terrifying work of reconstruction. He understands, even if he cannot say it aloud, that she was never a challenge to be overcome or a conquest to be won. She was an initiation, a threshold through which he was forced to pass whether he liked it or not. And passing through, he is changed. Not immediately, not entirely, but irrevocably. He has glimpsed a world where truth, presence, and wholeness matter more than dominance, performance, or superficial desire. And that glimpse will haunt him even in silence, even in absence, even in the lives he builds after her. The quietest moments are the most dangerous for him. In the stillness of a late evening, when the noise of routine fades and the masks of performance are set aside, he feels the weight of what she revealed. It is not a weight of regret, though, that is present, subtle and insistent, like a shadow that refuses to dissolve. It is the weight of awareness, the unrelenting gravity of a truth he cannot evade, that he has never truly been confronted before, that the world has tolerated his ego and rewarded his illusions, and that in her presence nothing of that could survive. She did not break him, but she exposed the fractures he had ignored for decades, and in those fractures he begins to see light fragile and trembling, yet unmistakable. Every gesture of hers, once so ordinary, now reverberates with meaning. The way she held her gaze, unwavering yet gentle. The way she left a room without drama, as if her absence carried more significance than her presence. The subtle insistence in her tone that demanded respect without a single demand. These were not performances, they were the quiet manifestations of a soul fully present. And he realizes that the tension he felt, the mix of fascination and fear, the desire to dominate and the compulsion to flee, was not about her. It was about the parts of himself he had never met. She was never his to possess. She was a guide, and his role was not to conquer, but to witness, to learn, and ultimately to transform. And yet the transformation is not linear. He stumbles, retreats, tells himself that she was too much, that he could never measure up. He flirts with illusions, seeks comfort in the familiar, tries to rebuild his armor. But each attempt is haunted by her absence, by the echo of a mirror that cannot be ignored. He begins to understand that her presence was not a gift to be held, but a challenge to be internalized. And internalization is painful. It requires humility, the willingness to face shame, the courage to recognize that what he once believed was strength was merely a veneer. Every encounter with her has left an invisible scar, a mark that will not fade, because it points to the truth of who he is and who he might yet become. In time, he notices the subtle shifts within himself. The arrogance that once guided his decisions softens. The need for control begins to loosen its grip. He listens differently, not just to others, but to himself. He begins to recognize the emptiness in his past attachments, the performative nature of his desires, the way he sought validation where presence was required. And in these realizations, he feels the faint thrill of something entirely new. Freedom, not the freedom of dominance or charm or conquest, but the freedom of being confronted with truth and choosing to grow. She has left, yet her lessons remain etched into his consciousness with the precision of a sculptor who understands the fragility of the form he is shaping. He also realizes that not every man will respond in this way. Many will run, will rationalize, will try to replace what they cannot face, but those who stay, even if only in memory and reflection, begin a slow, profound journey toward the self he was never allowed to see before. The encounter with her is not a romance. It is a confrontation with the deepest parts of the soul. It is an awakening to the shadow he carries, the parts of himself he has hidden from the world and from himself. She was never his to tame. She was the mirror that could not be ignored, and in ignoring it, he would remain incomplete. And slowly, he begins to understand that the woman he once labeled as difficult, as cold, as too much, was in truth the only one who could see him for who he truly was. Not the man he pretended to be, but the man he could become if he had courage enough to meet himself without pretense, without shields, without ego. She did not arrive to complete him. She arrived to provoke, to confront, to illuminate. And in that illumination, the first sparks of self-realization ignite, tiny and fragile, yet impossibly powerful. He begins to notice how the ordinary world itself has changed. A phrase from a conversation lingers longer. A glance across a crowded room ignites a memory that was never meant to fade. The weight of a silent absence presses against him with surprising intensity. He realizes that her presence was never about romance, about possession, about ego. It was about awakening. And that awakening cannot be erased. It lives in the corners of his mind, in the quiet spaces between his thoughts, in the soft ache that reminds him of what he had never allowed himself to feel. The woman who refused to shrink, who refused to conform, has become an invisible teacher. She is the threshold he must cross, whether he walks toward it consciously or stumbles into it by accident. In remembering her, he confronts his own limitations. The fear of vulnerability, the compulsion to control, the arrogance of assuming he could define her experience or shape her reality, all of it comes into sharp relief. She did not fight to be admired. She did not seek to provoke or punish. She simply carried her presence with quiet authority. And it is in that authority that he discovers the emptiness of his own strategies and the futility of his performances. And as he confronts these truths, he begins to experience a strange liberation. For the first time, he sees that strength is not the ability to bend another to his will, but the courage to confront himself honestly, without protection, without excuse. There is a long and painful grief in this realization. The grief is not for loss alone, but for the years he spent avoiding himself, the opportunities squandered, the relationships drained of authenticity, because he was too afraid to confront his own shadows. She was never just a woman in his life. She was a mirror, a gatekeeper, a challenge he could not ignore. And in her absence, he understands what it means to face the self he has avoided, to meet his fear, to see his fragility, and to recognize that love in its purest form is never about possession, but about presence, about truth, about courage. And so he begins cautiously at first to deconstruct the self he has relied upon for so long. He examines the armor, the postures, the stories he has told himself, the illusions of control that have guided his choices. He allows himself to feel the emptiness that her absence has revealed, and in that feeling, he discovers the subtle transformative pulse of awareness. It is uncomfortable, terrifying, even yet undeniable. Every memory of her, the quiet firmness, the unyielding gaze, the way she left without drama, becomes a lesson in the power of integrity and the quiet authority of the soul. She did not need to fight to be seen. She only needed to exist fully, and in doing so, she forced him to see himself fully. Gradually, he notices a subtle shift in the way he moves through the world. He listens differently, not to manipulate, not to control, not to impress, but to understand. He acts not to dominate or seduce, but to be present, to be real, to honor what is authentic in himself and in others. His past behaviors, chasing, demanding, performing, begin to lose their allure. They feel shallow in comparison to the depth of the awakening she triggered. And though he may never speak of her, may never attempt to return, may never even consciously recognize the extent of her influence, he carries her in the way a soul carries a lesson it cannot unlearn. She has left a scar, yet it is a scar of wisdom, not of pain. Every moment of reflection, every silent confrontation with himself, every choice to act with integrity rather than ego, is a tribute to the invisible force she became in his life. And he begins to see that the woman he once called bad was not a challenge to be overcome, but a portal to transformation. She was never his to claim. She was the awakening he could not avoid, the mirror that reflected what he most feared to see, and the spark that ignited a journey he may never have taken otherwise. In the stillness of his own life, long after she is gone, he begins to recognize the depth of what her presence truly meant. It was not a romance, not a fleeting attachment, not a series of beautiful gestures meant to be collected like souvenirs. It was a lesson, a silent revolution, a map to a territory he had always avoided, the landscape of his own soul. And he begins to understand with a clarity that almost terrifies him that she was never meant to stay. Some encounters are not designed for permanence. They exist only to awaken, to provoke, to illuminate what lies hidden in the quiet corners of our being. She was that awakening. He remembers the subtle ways she claimed space without apology, the way she moved through the world fully herself, the way she required nothing more than honesty, presence, and truth. He recalls the firm boundaries she held, the dignified silences, the refusal to bend for his ego or for anyone else. At the time, he had labeled her as difficult, perhaps even cruel. Now he sees that difficulty was the manifestation of her wholeness, the living proof of a soul unafraid. And he realizes that the discomfort she caused him was never hers to give. It was the reflection of what he could not yet face, his own limitations, his own fear, his own unfinished journey. He begins to reconstruct himself slowly, delicately, with reverence. The defenses he once relied upon, the arrogance, the charm, the need for control, begin to dissolve. Where once he sought validation from others, he now seeks presence within himself. Where once he measured love as conquest or possession, he now measures it as awareness, as courage, as quiet devotion to truth. Every memory of her becomes a guidepost, every echo of her absence a reminder of what he has learned, that love is not a transaction, not a game, not an acquisition. It is a reflection, a confrontation, a call to the parts of ourselves we have long refused to see. And in this reconstruction, he discovers a profound freedom. The freedom is not the kind heralded by ego or pride. It is deeper, subtler, yet infinitely more powerful. It is the freedom of a man who has faced himself without flinching, who has allowed himself to grieve, to recognize, to dismantle, and to rebuild. It is the freedom of a man who understands that true love, the kind that awakens and endures, is never about submission or control. It is about presence, truth, and the courage to meet another soul with integrity, without need, without manipulation, without artifice. He realizes finally that she was never the obstacle, never the adversary, never the prize. She was the mirror, the compass, the spark that ignited something within him that had always been waiting unnoticed beneath the surface. And though he may never see her again, though she may have walked into another life, another story, another chapter, her impact remains indelible. She became the threshold through which he entered a larger consciousness, a deeper awareness, a more honest existence. And that awareness is the gift that lasts, the one that shapes his choices, his presence, his capacity to love, to listen, to be real. Some men will never understand this. Some men will continue to chase, to manipulate, to seek illusions of power over love. But those who do awaken, those who confront the reflection she held up to them, carry a quiet reverence for her absence, for she was never theirs to own. She was theirs to meet, to see themselves reflected, to transform. And through that transformation, they begin to walk with a new consciousness, a new maturity, a new capacity for presence and truth. And in the end, he realizes that not all love is meant to last. Some love exists to awaken. Some love exists to illuminate the shadow, to expose the soul, to ignite growth. Some love exists simply to remind us that wholeness is not found in the other, but in the courage to meet ourselves fully. And she, the woman once called too much, too intense, too difficult, was that awakening. She was the mirror that could not be ignored, the spark that could not be extinguished, the silent revolution that forever altered the landscape of his heart and mind. If this reflection touched something deep within you, let it resonate. Share your thoughts, your stories, your awakenings. Like, comment, subscribe, and allow the journey of depth, presence, and conscious love to continue in the space we create together.